Right, let's get straight into it. Welcome to the explainer that's basically going to be your lifeline for the Florida Real Estate Sales Associate State Exam. Today, we're totally demystifying those notorious Chapter 475 brokerage relationships, because if you're grinding through FREC 1 prep right now, you already know this section is heavily tested, and frankly, the exam writers love setting traps here.
Listen, we've all felt that pit in our stomach looking at a failing Pearson View Score report, or at least had absolute nightmares about getting one. Test anxiety is real, and missing out by just a couple of points because of some slightly tricky wording, it's literally devastating. But today, we're making sure that is definitely not your fate.
So, to dodge the absolute trickiest questions they're going to throw at you, we're doing a high-yield, rapid-fire review of the rules. We'll be zeroing in on disclosure timing, agency transitions, and those highly specific agent arrangements. Mastering these mechanics is, without a doubt, the key to passing. Let's do this.
First up, we have to establish exactly where these disclosure rules actually apply, because the exam will 100% try to trip you up on property types. So remember, the strict disclosure requirements of Chapter 475 heavily target residential sales. And how exactly does Florida law define that? Well, it means 4 residential units or fewer, unimproved property intended for 4 units or fewer, or agricultural property of 10 acres or fewer. If you spot those numbers on the test, boom, strict residential disclosure rules apply.
Now, Florida law authorizes exactly 3 brokerage relationships. No more, no less. You can be a transaction broker, a single agent, or have no broker relationship at all. That's the whole shebang. Disclosed dual agency, meaning representing both the buyer and seller as a full fiduciary, is explicitly illegal in Florida. Actually, let me repeat that for emphasis. It is absolutely illegal. The state exam loves to test if you know the exact limits of these 3 legal relationships.
Okay, here is a massive exam trap you've got to watch out for. Say a test question asks, what relationship exists when a buyer just walks into an open house and starts chatting with an agent? Well, remember this. In Florida, you are legally presumed to be a transaction broker, providing limited representation, unless you establish otherwise in writing. Transaction broker is the absolute default. So let's look at how this builds when it comes to the strict timing mechanics, because when exactly do you hand over these written disclosures? Well, if you have a no-brokerage relationship, you must disclose this in writing before the showing of property. But for a single-agent relationship, the disclosure has to be made before or at the time of entering into a listing agreement or before the showing of property, whichever happens first. On the state exam, timing isn't just some minor detail, it's the whole ball game.
Right. I need you to lock this next phrase into your memory right now because it's a huge test trap. Prior, written, consent. If you're acting as a single agent for a seller and you find a buyer who wants to buy that property, you cannot represent both as a dual agent. You've got to transition to a transaction broker. And to do that, you absolutely must have prior written consent from your principal.
And Florida statute literally mandates the use of an exact uppercase heading for this. It has to say, consent to transition to transaction broker. The principal has to sign or initial this exact document to make the transition valid. No signature, no transition. It's really that simple.
Moving right along to the designated sales associate rules. The exam will definitely try to trick you here by throwing in a residential scenario, but just remember this strict mathematical formula. To use designated sales associates representing the buyer and seller as single agents in the same transaction, it must be a non-residential transaction. It must be requested by the customers, and both the buyer and the seller must each have over $1 million in assets. Okay, let's put this playbook into action. We're going to do a rapid-fire review quiz right now to cement this knowledge before test day. I'll read the question, give you a quick second to think, and then we'll break down the answer. Ready? Let's go.
Question 1. What relationship is presumed in Florida if absolutely nothing is put in writing with the customer? Think about the default.
The answer is transaction broker. The one-line reason you need to remember here is that limited representation is always the automatic default relationship under Chapter 475. All right, question 2. What is the exact timing requirement for providing a no-brokerage relationship disclosure? And the answer is before the showing of property. You absolutely have to disclose your non-representation duties up front before you ever walk a buyer through a house. Question 3. This is the big trap. A single agent wants to help both the buyer and seller in the same transaction. What specifically is required to change their status?
Prior written consent. You have to get the principal to actually sign the transition disclosure before you can legally act as a transaction broker for both parties.
And our final question. You have a buyer and a seller who both want single-agent representation in the exact same transaction. Under what specific conditions is a designated sales associate legally allowed?
Only in a non-residential transaction where both the buyer and the seller possess assets of $1 million or more. If it's a residential house, it's absolutely illegal, literally no matter how much money they have.
You know, by keeping these strict boundaries between residential rules, default presumptions, and written consent timelines crystal clear in your head, you are fully equipped to dodge the exam maker's absolute best traps. You now understand not just what the rules are, but exactly how they're going to test you on them.
So my final question to you is this. When you sit down at that Pearson VUE testing center, the clock is ticking, and you face a highly wordy, tricky question on changing agency roles, are you going to remember the golden rule of prior written consent to secure your passing score? Keep this explainer fresh in your mind, and you're absolutely going to crush it. Happy studying.